thoughts on, well, it's actually one of the future of gaming. How do you think those things will impact games in the future?
I think, right now, I think the biggest impact is actually pretty much in this room. Like, the people from academic game studies programs where you have opportunities to kind of experiment with what those potential answers can be, because I think once you get into commercial video game development, there are just so many other things that can pull you away from taking the big leaps and experimenting with what those potential answers could be. Does that make sense? Like, I think it's if game studies programs become just farms for independent developers, that's not a good thing, because it's great that more people can make a living making video games than ever before, but I don't actually see that as much innovation happening as I would hope by now. So I think it's about really taking the opportunity and building a strong foundation at this level, and hopefully setting you guys up for success in that unknown future of video games, to then start creating a loop where then you become the next big studio that is then influencing games. I think independent game development is a really tricky thing right now because we're also separate from one another, right? So there's no, this is going scattershot. I woke up at 3 o'clock this morning to fly here. Yeah, it's one of the problems with it, I think, is that there is no growing centralized hub of power and influence, the way that you have at a large publisher, right? So there are all sorts of issues with large-scale publishers, and they have huge financial obligations that they have to meet, and most of them are publicly traded, and they have all these problems that prevent them from really taking huge risks. But if you could grow a company from the ground up, that could take larger risks than in the way that a lot of independent developers do, but be able to create a nice hub and community and knowledge share. That's kind of what we're missing right now. It's like a lot of people are finding success and bubbling up, but it's just sort of going into the air in a way.
Right.
Did any of that make sense at all?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh, it was quite cohesive and coherent and
yeah. Like sometimes I guess it's like sometimes I wonder if instead of going the VC route, if that game company, if we had tried to go the more, okay, let's make a disc-based game that's, of AAA, like growing in that capacity.
Right.
What would that future have looked like?
Yeah. Well, do you think, say you were a college student right now in the same situation, and Shinobu, would be a college student right now as well, and you have exactly the same situation, but so many things have changed right now. I mean, if I look back at when I was a student, I wrote my own game engine because there was no Game Maker or Unity or anything.
Right, yeah.
You had to do all, that was where it started. You have graphics on the screen and they have to be 3D. So if you look at it that way, on the other hand, there are so many tools that will help you, but on the other hand, the field is just so saturated. So what are your thoughts on that actually? Do you feel that everything was just a perfect storm to happen what happened for you guys with that game company and your career? Or would you be like, well, if I'd be in the shoes of a student these days, everything will pan out just exactly the same?
If they would pan out exactly the same.
Well, by which I mean you would start the company and you'd have games on the market that would actually, you know, get a nice amount of exposure and people
Right.
would pick it up. They would be different games because somebody else would have made something,
Yeah.
well, that's conceptually similar to a flower or a flow, I guess, but.
It's possible. Certainly, I feel like we all, I mean, I'm not speaking for the rest of the team, but I do feel like everyone that was a part of Flow, Flower, and Journey really got a lot out of our relationship with Sony because they, by necessity, had to hold us to this high standard of making a game that would show off the PlayStation 3 well, right? Like we were in this second party, you know, exclusive arrangement with them. So always that was one of the mandates. And I feel like they taught us a lot about what it means to execute on the last 10%. Have you talked to your students about the last 10%?
Yeah, well,
yeah.
Which took 2 years probably for Journey, I think.
Took 2 years, is that what you said? Well,
wasn't
yeah.
Journey delayed for 2 years longer than originally was planned? I think I remember something. But It's been a while. I might be wrong.
Yeah, it was, yeah. It's definitely something I see now being on the other side of things at Ouya. It's been a huge learning experience to like be exposed to many, many different types of developers and independent and non-independent. But definitely what I see is, especially now that the market is so much more competitive, that last 10% is so crucial on, I mean, it really is a life-changing difference for the developer of a game if they can nail that final 10% or not. And I, as of today, do not necessarily know if I could pick out the developer who can do that and who cannot do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big challenge for any developer, and that's something I think about with Genova and I. If we were doing it all over again, maybe we would have. I mean, Genova especially certainly always holds himself to a very high standard. Now he's so successful. There's like, I think, even more reason for that probably. But even as a student, there was always this sense about his work that I was like, there's no reason my work can't look like that work. Like he was very customer minded in that way, right? Because the customer's not going to know the difference between this Flash game and that Flash game, like that this Flash game was made by 30 people and this Flash game was made by 2 people. So he always held himself to that standard. But I don't know that, like, had we then gone on to be solely independent, if we necessarily would have been as successful or as made as much of an impact.
Right.
Part of it was that relationship with Sony and having to make games for a console like PlayStation 3 that pushed us really hard.
Yeah. Does Sony actually do that type of collaboration still? I'm not really aware of that.
Yes, I know that the Unfinished Swan developer, whose name is escaping me, but also is incubated at Sony.
Right.
I think they're still looking for opportunities, but I don't know if they're incubating other developers at the moment.
Right. Well, it's good that it's still going on.
Giant Sparrow, got it.
Right. Yeah, but if it makes, it made a huge difference for you guys, as you just said. So.
Yeah, and again, it's something certainly where, from the perspective of graduating from school and starting a studio, I didn't realize how influential that was or how important that was until now that I'm on the other side. I can definitely see.
Okay, here's another one of the questions. Do you feel like you've made it?
Ha!
You're saying I'm looking at it from the other side.
Well, looking at it on the publishing side now.
Right. Yeah. No. But.
Did I?
Do you ever get that sense as a game designer, or?
I'm really glad Journey won Game of the Year, like a bunch of times, because it's like there's a pressure that I feel to live up to that, but there's also a certain relief of like, okay, well, if I never do anything ever again, at least I did that.
Yeah.
But I'm not gonna stop or anything. This is not my retirement speech.
It would be a little early.
But I think it's allowed me to like give myself permission to take a break or not put so much pressure on myself. And as we were talking about, I've had stress management issues that I could probably write a book about one day. But yeah, it's nice. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things, this is not a student question, but I picked up on it. Do you have any stories about dealing with, the fan culture? And Gamergate might be related to that as well. But recently, for example, Peter Molyneux had this with Godus that they kickstarted, and it blew up in his face basically. And an awful interview that I recently read. I was like, oh my gosh, what is this journalist asking of him? Do you have any of those types of stories where, well, you guys are supposed to be my fans, and what's happening here? Because we made this game, and then you get a very negative response to it, or?
I don't read a lot of internet comments. I try to avoid it. It's just a bad hole to go down. I think a lot of that game company fans are super supportive. There have certainly been times in the middle of Journey, especially where there was a little, oh, where's the game? Like, when is it ever coming out? But for the most part, the fans and the press were really supportive of that game company, which was weird when I then went to Ouya and kind of had a very different experience because Kickstarted projects it's tough. It is. I don't know of very many Kickstarter projects that haven't experienced something like what Godus just went through. Broken Age went through it. Ouya's been through it. There's this delta between the promise and the optimism and idealism that everyone has at the beginning of the project, and then the reality of what gets made at the end of it. And gamers are really passionate, and that is really awesome, but can be really terrible when you're on the bad end of it. And I think for Ouya as well, it was weird because I felt like Ouya in a lot of ways was really similar to that game company as far as trying to be a disruptor, trying to show that things could be done a different way, that games could be something else than what everyone thought they were. But for many reasons, Ouya kind of got on the wrong, I don't know, it just became really popular to knock Ouya. And so it was very jarring for me to be in situations where I felt like, oh, I have to like manage what I'm saying more, be careful, because the journalist is going to grab that really poorly articulated sentence now and say that. Whereas with that game company, it felt like Genova and I would often say things that were really poorly articulated, but the journalist was maybe helping us sound good because they wanted to see us succeed.
Yeah, well, that's really nice. How do you perceive, the pressure of journalists in general on your work on the industry? Because they have a lot of power, and I often hear from game developers that, oh gosh, we should have, talked to that journalist when they asked us for something, or we should have made sure that they saw, our game in early access type of thing or something. Is that something that's a lot of pressure to be in?
So, it's like I've never worked at a company with HR. I never have worked on something that I couldn't be personally passionate about. I mean, if I'm not into something, I've never been good at just having a job. I am really bad at it, actually. I do a bad job. I sabotage the project I'm working on. Like, it's like really...
This is really good advice.
Like, thanks. So for me, it was almost like entrepreneurship. I had to go that way because when I was entering games, there weren't any companies doing the kind of games I wanted to be doing. And I had this opportunity to do exactly that. Where were we before I was like sabotaging
just keep going.
So I feel like sometimes people have a misperception of me that I'm really good at navigating the media. When that's not true, it's that I'm really good at talking about the things I care about. And I never, it's like I believed in what that game company was doing. I believe in what Leah is doing. And I have no problem talking to people about those things. And that's an organic relationship I can then have with people in the press. Because I do genuinely connect with them. I think there have been many developers who have mentioned this sort of throughout the Gamergate controversy, but that in a lot of ways, like, the division between gamers and game makers is very blurry. Sometimes I wondered if we weren't just really, like, game makers all primarily making games for each other. Like, that we were just, like, dominantly the people spending money on games, too, and we were just doing it. We were making the whole industry happen. But it extends to all of the various careers in the games industry. So, yeah, I connect with game journalists and have built relationships with them because we are similar as gamers and we have similar hobbies, and like, you know what it's like to grow up in places where you feel like an outcast, and then to find this community of people that's so similar to you is really awesome. And so I never felt like I was selling my games to these people. I was just talking about the thing that I thought was really important. So I'm probably terrible at asking for just straight up PR advice or marketing advice, but yeah.
That was her opening question.
Exactly, like, just
should have warned you.
Be passionate about it. Find the thing that you believe in, and stick to that. I remember Alexander Bruce, the developer of Antichamber, mentioning this. I believe he mentioned it in his GDC talk, but that early on he kind of got some feedback from other developers, like, man, you're kind of intense, and like, I can tell that you're just working me right now. Like, you're just kind of selling you and your game to me, and you don't need to do that. And that he had kind of worked to strip that away and build more and be more genuine about what it is you're working on. Because people, especially right now, we're just at a time where people really respond to that, right? They really respond to genuineness.
Yeah, I think it's one of the, it's one of the main concerns that people are talking about with the Gamersgate thing as well, about, well, they're phrasing it as that journalism has to be objective, which is obviously ridiculous, because objective journalism is just, putting numbers out there. But it is very difficult to not create relationships between journalists and this indie community, because there's no PR department in between, as you were saying.
Right.
So yeah, I think I have, how are we doing on time actually? We're still good? Cause
probably a couple in the audience.
Okay. I think this is one that I definitely want to ask you before we're done here.
Okay.
So what does your creative game design process look like? Do you have, a specific methodology maybe, or some way of going about that helps you to get into a creative mode for when you're thinking about game concepts? Is it something you just do spontaneously throughout the day? Is it, what does your creative process look like?
in thinking about game concepts, I kind of like, so one of my favorite things about games as a medium, as opposed to all the other mediums I've been a part of and worked in, is this somewhat objective process of the playtest, which I don't think you can really do when you're writing a song or writing a play or anything, where you're like, you get to pretty quickly take your idea, put it outside of yourself, and then watch if people are resonating with it or whether it's frustrating or not, and all those things. So pretty quickly, I like to get an idea out there and people engaging with it and then build on that. I remember someone saying that a great game designer is not someone who has a great idea for a game mechanic. It's someone who has 100 other ideas when you find out that first idea sucked. And that's totally true. It's just like, I love that part of it. So usually it's, there's always like a bunch of ideas kicking around, and maybe one takes hold for long enough that I want to get it out there and play with it. In commercial video game development, there are all sorts of factors that you're kind of play testing for, prototyping for, which is what is you or your team's ability to execute? Like, what are the resources you have available, not just in money and time, but also, what tool is your artist best at, and like, what's your engineer most interested in working on, and kind of prototyping on every level to